At the Monday meeting, before the coffee even cooled, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "You're a dinosaur. Your methods don't belong in this century." The words weren't shouted, they were spoken with a cold, casual certainty, and that made them strike even deeper. Laughter followed, nervous at first, then sharper, until it filled the air like glass breaking. In that moment, I was no longer a colleague, no longer an equal, no longer the man whose calculations had carried this company through disasters before. I was reduced to a relic, a figure they tolerated but no longer trusted. I sat there, still, my hands folded on the table, a faint smile on my lips to mask the sting. Inside, though, the words burrowed deep. A dinosaur. Outdated. Irrelevant. I had given years, decades of my life, shaping steel, drafting systems, building structures that stood firm when storms and failures had threatened to tear them down. I had worked nights while others slept, sacrificing family dinners, missing milestones, to ensure that when the world demanded strength, our designs would not fail. And now, with one careless remark, all of it was dismissed as something past its worth. The manager leaned forward, his eyes shining with youthful arrogance, announcing that I would be graciously stepping aside from the new project. He framed it as respect, as if giving me rest was an honor, but beneath the words was the truth. They no longer wanted me. They wanted the fresh voices, the glossy models, the PowerPoint slides dressed in modern fonts. My experience was not valued, my presence not desired. I was invited to watch, but not to shape. Around the table, younger colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my gaze. Some looked with a hint of pity, but none spoke. It was easier to stay silent, to let the tide of dismissal carry me out, than to stand against it. My daughter had once told me that silence in a room often hurts more than words, and in that moment I felt the weight of her wisdom. The silence was not neutral, it was agreement. They had chosen to let me fade. Still, I did not protest. I smiled, as though their decision was reasonable, as though it did not slice at the very core of who I was. I gathered my notes, slowly, carefully, so they would not see the trembling in my hands. And when I stood to leave, I said nothing. For what words could I offer that arrogance would understand? My silence became my shield, but inside, a fire smoldered quietly. They thought my skills were outdated, my methods irrelevant, my years a burden rather than a gift. What they did not see, what they could not yet imagine, was that the very project they were celebrating, the very foundation they were so eager to claim as their own, still rested on principles written not in trend, but in truth. My blueprints, my calculations, my so-called old-fashioned methods, they were not dead, they were waiting, and time, I knew, would give them a voice louder than any insult. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. The whispers began almost immediately after I was pushed aside. They weren't meant for me, but I heard them all the same. In the corridors where we once shared ideas, in the break room where plans had been drawn on napkins and refined into reality, I now heard the careful voices of a younger generation speaking of a new era. Their words carried the certainty of people convinced that the future belonged only to them, that the past was nothing more than a burden to be discarded. They spoke of innovation as if it were a wall dividing them from everything that had come before, not a bridge built on years of labor. And in their eagerness to proclaim progress, they erased the very hands that had laid the first stones. The young manager became the loudest voice in this chorus. His tone was slick, his words polished, his vision wrapped in images and slides that sparkled under the conference room lights. He described new systems as though they were revelations, dismissing with a casual wave of his hand the methods we had used to keep the company alive through crises that would have destroyed it otherwise. That was then, he would say, his voice tinged with the arrogance of someone who had never faced the storm himself. Now we build differently. And each time he spoke those words, heads around the table nodded, not because they truly understood, but because it was easier to agree than to stand against the tide of his confidence. Colleagues who once worked shoulder to shoulder with me now avoided my eyes. Men and women who had celebrated victories with me in years past turned their shoulders slightly when I passed, unwilling to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that the future they praised had been made possible by the very past they were discarding. It is easier, after all, to bow to youth and its promises of glittering success than to honor the calloused hands of experience. I saw it in their faces, the quiet betrayal of convenience. They wanted to believe in the shine, because the shine distracted them from the weight of gratitude. I carried their whispers with me like stones in my pocket, heavy but hidden. They thought I did not notice, that age had dulled not only my skills but my awareness. But I heard every word. I saw every nod. I felt the sting of every silence that followed when my name was spoken. It was not rage that filled me, not even sorrow. It was something quieter, something heavier, the knowledge that history was repeating itself, that arrogance always believes it is the first to stand on new ground, forgetting the foundations beneath its feet. At night, I would sit at my desk, running my hands over the old blueprints I had kept. The lines, the angles, the calculations, they were not outdated. They were alive. They carried within them the lessons of failure and the discipline of trial, the weight of choices made not in the safety of a boardroom but in the fire of real crisis. Those papers were not relics. They were warnings. And I knew, as I listened to the whispers of replacement growing louder each day, that the world they were so eager to build would soon be tested. When it was, it would not be their glittering presentations that saved them. It would be the quiet truth buried in the blue ink of a blueprint they had long dismissed. They called it a gesture of honor, a consultative role, a title wrapped in polite words but stripped of any real weight. No decisions, no vote, no place at the table where the future was drawn. It was exile, dressed as respect, a final pat on the shoulder meant to ease me out of the door. Smiles accompanied the announcement, hollow smiles that pretended generosity, but behind them was relief, the relief of those who no longer wished to hear the voice that reminded them of limits, of risks, of lessons written in scars and sweat. I listened in silence, nodding as if the offer were fair. But inside, I felt the sting of betrayal. To be told that my decades of labor, my nights without sleep, my sacrifices for projects that had carried them safely through storms, now amounted to nothing more than a ceremonial chair in the corner. It hollowed the room around me. They wanted me to exist as a relic, a token to display when convenient, but never a voice that might still carry authority. It was a slow burial, not of my body, but of my worth. When the meeting ended, I returned to my office, a space I had occupied for years, filled with the scent of old paper and the dust of memory. The shelves bore trophies of battles fought and won, models of systems that still stood firm because I had refused to let them fall. But now the office felt smaller, as if the walls themselves knew my time was being written out. I opened the drawers and began to gather my belongings. A few framed photographs, a pen worn smooth from years of use, a battered notebook with equations scribbled in margins. Each item I placed gently into the cardboard box, as though packing away not objects, but fragments of my own life. And then my hand rested on the folder. A thick bundle of papers bound by a fading cover, corners worn from handling. Inside were the blueprints, the design they had dismissed, the plan they had never bothered to open. It was the product of long nights, of calculations tested and retested, of solutions drawn from years of lived failures. I had left it with them once, hoping they would read it, hoping they would see its worth. They never did. It had sat untouched, gathering dust, forgotten before its time. I placed it on the shelf, not in the box. I did not take it with me. I left it there, like a seed buried in soil that no one had yet bothered to water. They thought it was useless, irrelevant, an artifact of outdated thinking. But I knew differently. I knew that when the storm came, and storms always come, that blueprint would breathe. They would reach for it, perhaps in desperation, perhaps in shame. And when they did, they would discover that what they had called outdated was in fact the only thing strong enough to save them. I closed the office door behind me, carrying my small box in my arms. To them, it looked like a departure, a quiet exit of a man finally stepping aside. But the folder on the shelf remained, waiting, patient, silent. And in its silence it carried more power than all their glittering words. The office was dark that night, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp that cast long shadows across the desk. The corridors outside were empty, the building silent, as though the world itself had already turned its back on me. Yet I remained, my pen scratching across the paper, line by line, as if each stroke carried the weight of memory, of warning, of lives not yet touched by disaster. Before me lay the blueprint, the same one they had ignored, dismissed, shelved without a glance. But tonight it was not a relic. Tonight, it breathed. Every mark on the page was not just ink, it was the echo of moments lived, mistakes endured, lessons paid for in sleepless nights and sweat-drenched mornings. Each number carried a story, the near collapse that was stopped just in time, the system that only held because someone thought beyond theory, the silent gratitude of workers who never knew how close they came to tragedy. They thought these lines were outdated, but I knew they were alive, each one a shield against the failures that arrogance could never anticipate. As I wrote the explanatory notes, my hand trembled, not from age, but from urgency. I wrote in simple words, stripped of the glamour that filled their reports, because safety does not live in glitter. It lives in clarity. Close these valves first, I wrote. Divert pressure here. Do not overload beyond this point. Protect the weakest link before the strongest breaks. To anyone skimming, it might seem dull, even obvious. But those words, those precise sequences, were the difference between silence and sirens, between stability and ruin. I paused often, leaning back in my chair, the weight of the years pressing on me. I thought of the men and women who worked on the ground, whose lives hung on the calculations drawn in rooms like this. I thought of the families who depended on those workers returning home. And I thought of the arrogance that had blinded the new generation, their faith in shiny systems that had never been tested in the fire of real crisis. They did not see it now, but they would. Sooner or later the storm comes, and when it does, the room always searches for the map it once ignored. By the time dawn crept across the sky, the notes were finished. My eyes burned from fatigue, but my spirit was steady. I closed the folder gently, almost reverently, and placed it back on the shelf. To anyone who found it, it would look like an old man's scribbles, a stack of paper out of place in a digital world. But to those who would need it, truly need it, it was life itself. I stood at the door of the office, turning once to look back. The blueprint sat waiting in the quiet, patient and unassuming, like a heart that beats unnoticed until the moment it is needed most. They thought I was finished, that my skills were outdated, that my worth had expired. But paper does not age the way pride does, and when the day of reckoning arrived, the blueprint would speak for me, louder than any defense I could give, clearer than any insult they had thrown. That night, as I walked out into the cold air, I did not feel defeated. I felt something else, something like prophecy. The launch was treated like a festival. Bright lights bathed the hall, cameras lined the stage, and banners declared the dawn of a revolutionary era. The new team stood in sharp suits and polished shoes, their voices confident, their smiles rehearsed. They spoke of breakthroughs, of innovation, of bold visions for the future, their words wrapped in technical jargon designed to impress those who understood little but wanted to believe much. Every slide of their presentation glowed with colors and animations, as if beauty could substitute for resilience, as if style could replace substance. The crowd applauded at every turn. Investors nodded with wide eyes. Journalists scribbled notes. Colleagues clapped as though the sound of their palms could drown out the nagging question in the back of their minds. Would it hold? Pride filled the air like perfume, intoxicating and sweet but dangerously thin. They praised the speed, the efficiency, the sleek design of the prototype, never stopping to ask if it had the strength to endure a storm. I sat in the back of the room, uninvited but present, a silent figure among the noise. No one turned to me. No one sought my opinion. To them, I was yesterday's man in yesterday's chair, a spectator to brilliance I could never grasp. Yet as the model was unveiled and demonstrated, I saw not brilliance, but fragility. The lines of its framework carried flaws, small to the untrained eye, but glaring to one who had seen failure up close. The calculations they celebrated as cutting edge had ignored the subtle truths learned only through years of trial, the truths buried in the margins of old notebooks and etched in the instincts of men who had stood by machines when alarms screamed. I wanted to speak, to raise my hand, to remind them that a structure is only as strong as its weakest joint, that efficiency without safety is a blade without a handle. But I did not. I had tried before, and they had laughed. They would laugh again. And so I sat still, watching as the applause grew louder, as the flash of cameras captured a triumph that was built on fragile ground. The prototype was switched on for the first time, its lights glowing like a newborn star. Cheers erupted, voices rose, hands clapped, and some even stood to celebrate. They spoke of how it would change everything, how the old ways could finally be buried, how the future had arrived in the hum of new machinery. Yet, as I watched the system flicker to life, I saw something else. Not a future, but a countdown. The numbers in my head raced faster than the applause, warning me that beneath the surface, strain was already whispering, pressure was already rising, and instability was already waiting. But no one cared for whispers of warning when the music was playing. Pride has a way of making people deaf. They celebrated as though they had conquered time itself, as though progress meant immunity from failure. And I remained silent, not because I was blind, but because I knew the truth. Storms always come, and only what is built to endure survives them. The day would arrive when the applause would fade into panic, when the cameras would turn not to glory, but to chaos. And when that day came, they would search desperately for something solid to hold on to. They did not know it yet, but that something had already been written, in lines of ink they had refused to read. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. At first they were small, barely noticeable flickers in the system, a warning light here, a minor delay there, the kind of signals that experience teaches you to treat like fire alarms, but which arrogance prefers to dismiss as nothing. The team gathered around the screens, brushing aside the signs with rehearsed smiles. Every new model has teething problems, they said, their voices light with confidence. It's just part of the adjustment process. They laughed at the term failure, as though the word itself belonged to an older, forgotten language. But I knew better. I'd lived long enough to understand that systems speak before they break. They whisper warnings in the hum of a motor, in the uneven pulse of pressure, and the subtle shift of numbers on a screen. Those whispers are ignored only by those who have never stood in the dark with alarms screaming and lives depending on a single decision. I had, and I recognized the voice of danger when I heard it. So I sat down at my desk and wrote, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the calm precision of someone who knows that truth needs no embellishment. I laid out the risks line by line, each calculation steady, each warning supported by numbers that did not lie. I wrote not to shame them, but to save them, from pride, from blindness, from disaster that was already creeping closer. The letter was clear, patient, professional. It carried no accusation, only the plea of reason. Look again. Strengthen these points. Reinforce before it's too late. I sent it, not expecting applause, but hoping for honesty. Days passed, and silence was my reply. Weeks, and still nothing. Then I learned what had become of my message. It had been forwarded, glanced at, dismissed. Old concerns from an old man, one of them had said. Archive it. We'll handle this our way. And so my letter, written in the ink of caution, was buried in a digital folder no one would open until it was too late. The alarms kept whispering. Pressure gauges fluctuated. Valves strained. The rhythm of the system faltered. But each time they smiled. They reassured. They spoke of minor glitches. They walked past the warning lights as though they were decorations. They raised glasses in celebration of progress, blind to the fire kindling beneath their feet. I watched in silence, carrying a heaviness deeper than anger. For anger, at least, believes it can still change something. What I felt was the sorrow of a man who sees a storm forming and knows the people around him have chosen not to notice. They thought my skills outdated, my warnings unnecessary, my voice irrelevant. Yet as the alarms whispered louder, I understood one thing with painful clarity. They would not listen until silence turned to chaos. And when that chaos came, their only hope would be the blueprint waiting in the dark, the same one they had refused to open. It happened on the night when the city was most alive. Streets pulsed with traffic, towers blazed with light, machines hummed at their fullest capacity. It was the hour when everything depended on the system holding steady. And then, without warning, the hum became a roar, the lights became a flicker, and in an instant the heart of the city began to fail. One by one, grids went dark, street lamps dimmed, then died, whole districts falling into silence. Screens froze mid-sentence, elevators shuddered and stopped, alarms howled where silence had been demanded. In the factories, pressure surged wildly, gauges spun, needles trembled against red lines, and water rose in places where it should never rise. The system that had been hailed as the future collapsed under the weight of the present. Panic spread faster than the failure itself. Phones rang unanswered, radios crackled with static, leaders barked orders no one could carry out. The sleek designs, the glittering presentations, the applause from launch night, none of it mattered now. The truth was raw and merciless. The model they had praised was not built to endure. It broke under strain, as fragile as glass against stone, and the city paid the price. I sat in my small room, far from their command center, but I felt the weight of it all. Reports poured in. Transformers overheated, valves jammed, systems designed to be flawless, buckled like cheap metal under strain. The water that should have been contained rose with frightening speed, threatening to flood the plant and cripple production entirely. The revolutionary prototype, celebrated under chandeliers and applause, had met the test of reality, and reality had torn it apart. In the darkness of that night, I thought of the blueprint left behind, the folder resting quietly on the shelf, filled with instructions for this very moment, a map they had never read, a lifeline buried under dust and arrogance. My warnings had been ignored, my voice silenced, my experience dismissed. Yet here was the truth. All their pride, all their promises, all their brilliance had brought them to their knees in less time than it took for a city to lose power. And still I felt no triumph. Only a heavy sorrow settled in my chest, because I knew that while humiliation might fall on the leaders, suffering would fall on the people. Families would sit in darkness. Hospitals would scramble to save patients. Workers would stand ankle-deep in water, praying the system would not fail completely. The innocent always pay for the pride of the powerful. The night of failure had come, sweeping away the illusions built in conference halls. The applause had ended. The city, once glowing, lay in shadow, and all that remained was the quiet truth, waiting on a shelf. Lines of ink that could have prevented this. Lines they would soon be forced to turn to when desperation left them no other choice. The conference room, once a place of polished presentations and self-assured speeches, now reeked of fear. The scent of coffee gone cold mixed with the sweat of men and women who had built their reputations on confidence, and now that confidence had collapsed. Screens that once glowed with colorful graphs now flashed red warnings. Equations filled the whiteboard, half erased, rewritten, erased again, as if the frantic scribbles themselves could hold back the rising tide. Every attempt to steady the system failed. The new models, so proudly hailed as the dawn of progress, refused to bend. They simply broke. Algorithms that had seemed flawless on paper froze in loops, unable to adapt to chaos that demanded instinct rather than code. Voices clashed. Some shouted orders, others defended themselves, and still others tried to vanish into silence, hoping blame would pass over them. Responsibility had become a hot coal passed from hand to trembling hand. No one wanted to hold it. It wasn't my sector, one insisted. The calculations were approved, another snapped. Their words grew sharper, their tones rising, but none of it mattered. The truth was merciless and undeniable. The system had failed, and so had they. I was not in the room, but I could imagine it with painful clarity, for I had seen such rooms before. I knew the look in their eyes, the pale faces lit by screens. They no longer trusted, the tight fists gripping pens that could not solve what instinct should have foreseen. Fear has a smell, and it lingers heavier than perfume. It is the smell of people who realize too late that they are not prepared, that their pride has led them to the edge of a cliff they do not know how to climb down from. They scrambled to patch holes in their models, to reroute flows, to issue commands that contradicted one another. The younger engineers, once brimming with arrogance, stared helplessly at data that made no sense, numbers that spiraled beyond control. They had never been trained to improvise, to bend rules without breaking them, to see solutions where none were written. They had been trained to shine in rooms like this, not to survive nights like this. And through it all, the blueprint remained untouched on the shelf, its quiet wisdom ignored, its pages sleeping, while chaos raged. It was there, waiting, with every instruction they needed: how to divert pressure, how to bleed the system safely, how to slow disaster before it became irreversible. But the men and women in that room had long ago decided that my voice, my experience, my methods were outdated. And now they were prisoners of their own blindness, trapped in a room where fear ruled and answers hid in plain sight. As the night dragged on, the panic only deepened. Phones rang with demands from higher offices, from city officials, from desperate voices asking when the lights would return. Each unanswered call was another blow, another crack in the facade of control. The leaders hunched over their notes, their eyes wide with exhaustion and shame, realizing that all their brilliance, all their promises, all their glittering words had no power against reality. The room grew quieter, the shouting replaced by something heavier: despair. They were not solving a problem anymore. They were waiting for something, anything, to rescue them from their own failure. And though none of them would admit it aloud, every face carried the same silent question. Had they been wrong to ignore the man they had cast aside? It was not brilliance that saved them that night, it was desperation. When the shouting had burned itself into silence, when the screens only reflected numbers no one understood, when even the most confident voices had fallen mute, someone finally thought to search where no one had looked. The secretary, a young woman whose role had always been to fetch coffee, print agendas, and tidy forgotten papers, opened the cabinet by the wall. Her hands shook as she rifled through folders abandoned and ignored, relics of meetings past. And then she saw it, a thick volume, its edges worn, its cover dulled with dust, The kind of thing that seemed out of place in a room built on sleek screens and wireless tablets. On the spine in fading ink was my name. She hesitated, then pulled it out, laying it on the table with the reverence of someone who knew instinctively that what she held mattered. At first no one moved. The senior engineers glanced at it as if it were a ghost, as if to touch it would be to admit their own failure. But finally, one reached forward, the oldest among them, a man who had once worked beside me in silence, who remembered nights when my steady hand had kept systems breathing. He opened the folder and began to read. His face drained of color as his eyes moved across the pages. Line by line, calculation by calculation, note by note, he saw everything they had missed. There, in clear script, was the sequence for diverting pressure, the exact order of valves to be shut, the timing required to keep the water from rising beyond the point of no return. Diagrams traced the paths of safety that their computers had never modeled, paths only experience could have drawn. In the margins, I had written small instructions, simple, human words to guide engineers in crisis. Check twice before closing. Never skip this step. Remember the weakest link. They were not elegant. They were not dressed in the language of modernity, but they were alive. The room leaned closer. Whispered voices replaced the silence. Fingers traced the diagrams. Nods spread as the realization struck them all at once. This was what they had needed. This was the map through the storm. All their proud algorithms had failed. All their dazzling presentations had collapsed, and now the blueprint they had called outdated became their last hope. The senior engineer looked up, his hands trembling. His eyes carried not just fear but shame. He remembered the day I had left that folder on the shelf, offering it quietly, without demand, without pride. He remembered how quickly they had dismissed it, how easily they had labeled it irrelevant. And now he held in his hands the very thing that could save them. The weight of that realization bent his shoulders lower than exhaustion ever could. Around the table, no one dared speak the truth aloud, but it hung there, heavy as stone. The man they had called a dinosaur had left behind the only lifeline strong enough to hold, and with every line they read, every instruction they followed, they could no longer deny it. They had not outgrown him. They had abandoned him. And now, in the hour of their collapse, his voice, buried in ink and paper, rose louder than all their pride. The room that had been filled with shouting just hours before was now wrapped in a heavy, reverent silence. No one boasted, no one argued. The blueprint lay open in the center of the table like scripture, its pages lit by the cold glow of emergency lamps. Every eye fixed on the lines and notes that only moments ago they would have called old-fashioned. Now those same lines had become the fragile thread between ruin and survival. The senior engineer barked no orders, raised no voice. He simply pointed to the page, and hands obeyed. It was not authority that guided them now, but the weight of truth they could no longer deny. Valves began to turn, slowly, carefully, in the precise sequence written in my notes. No improvisation, no shortcuts. Each step was followed as if their lives depended on it, because they finally understood that they did. One by one, the gauges stopped their frantic trembling and began to steady. The wild surges of pressure eased as the flow was diverted along the paths I had mapped years ago. Alarms still screamed, but their tones softened, shifting from chaos to order. The water, which had risen like an unchained beast, slowed in its climb. For the first time that night, the system exhaled. No one dared to speak as they worked. The pride that had once filled their voices had drained away, leaving only determination and shame. Hands that had once waved dismissively at my warnings now trembled slightly as they followed my instructions to the letter. Even the youngest engineers, who had never looked me in the eye, leaned over the blueprint with reverence, their faces pale, as they realized how close they had come to catastrophe. The words outdated and irrelevant hung like curses in their minds, reminders of their arrogance, now buried beneath the undeniable clarity of survival. The calculations were not glamorous. They lacked the sleek elegance of algorithms or the drama of digital models. But they worked. They had been forged in the crucible of real crises, not in the comfort of simulations. Every line carried the weight of experience, every margin note the voice of a man who had once stood in the same kind of night, listening to the same alarms. And now, in their desperation, those lines held the world together. Slowly the tide shifted. The indicators began to settle, red lines dipping back into yellow, yellow edging closer to green. Systems that had threatened to collapse bent instead, redistributing their load exactly as the blueprint had predicted. The engineers, pale with exhaustion, lifted their eyes from the dials to the folder, as though afraid to look away, as though the paper itself had become the heartbeat of the room. And though no one said it aloud, every face betrayed the same realization. The man they had dismissed had been here all along, holding them even in absence. My voice, ignored in life, had risen in ink. My blueprint had become their salvation. The lines they once mocked had become the lines that held. When the first light of morning spread across the city, it revealed a place both wounded and alive. The sirens had quieted, their shrill cries replaced by the low hum of systems that had been pulled back from the edge. Street by street, district by district, the lamps flickered and came to life again, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the dark shell of the night gave way to fragile brightness. Windows glowed, kettles whistled, radios crackled back to life, and the city exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. People stepped outside, blinking at the returning light as though it were a gift rather than something they had always taken for granted. In the control rooms, exhausted faces sagged with relief. Engineers slumped into chairs, their shoulders heavy not only with fatigue but with shame. They had followed the blueprint, page after page, and it had carried them to safety. No algorithms, no dazzling models, no revolutionary promises, just ink on paper, drawn by hands they had mocked as too old to matter. As the pressure gauges steadied and the water stopped its climb, silence filled the room, a silence so thick it felt like a confession. No one dared to celebrate. No one dared to speak of triumph. There was only the quiet recognition that the city stood not because of them, but because of the man they had cast aside. Beyond the walls, the world began to talk. News outlets that only yesterday had praised innovation now spoke in softer tones. The crisis had nearly destroyed them, and recovery had not come from the promised brilliance of new designs, but from the steady wisdom buried in an outdated blueprint. Headlines shifted, voices wavered, and though my name had not yet been spoken, the truth was already moving beneath the surface. The survival of the city belonged to someone they had chosen to forget. My daughter watched from her home, her phone buzzing with messages of panic, then of relief. She had wept in the dark, clutching her children close, remembering how often her husband had dismissed me, how often she herself had stayed silent. And now, as the lights returned, she wondered if they would finally see, if the world would finally understand what she had known all her life, that my strength was never in applause or recognition, but in the quiet, stubborn resilience that endured even when others turned away. The city stirred, alive but chastened. In the streets, people spoke of gratitude without knowing whom to thank. In the offices, leaders prepared statements that carefully avoided blame. In the hearts of those who had once laughed, unease began to grow. The silence after the sirens was not peace, it was judgment, a reminder that arrogance had nearly drowned them, and that their salvation had not come from their own brilliance, but from the hands of a man they had refused to hear. And as the sun climbed higher, washing the skyline in gold, the blueprint still lay on the table, its pages smudged with fingerprints, its edges creased from frantic hands. It was no longer dismissed. It was no longer ignored. It had become the lifeline of an entire city. And though they had not yet said it aloud, everyone who had touched those pages carried the same thought in their chest. They owed their mourning to the man whose voice they had silenced. The folder still lay open on the table long after the alarms had fallen silent, its pages spread like a lifeline that no one dared to close. Dawn's pale light crept in through the tall windows of the control room, brushing against diagrams inked years before, diagrams that had carried the weight of the night. The engineers, drained and hollow-eyed, leaned over it once more, not in doubt, not in dismissal, but in reverence. And then one of them noticed something that none of them had cared to see before. In the margin, written in steady, deliberate handwriting, was my name. Not a flourish, not a boast, just a simple signature, followed by a date that stretched back further than most of them had worked here. Next to it, in small letters, a note from the time of testing. Verified under pressure, safe under failure. Repeat if necessary. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still carried a clarity that silence could not dim. For a moment the room grew even quieter, the kind of quiet that comes not from exhaustion but from shame. The leaders who had once sat in boardrooms dismissing me as irrelevant stared at the signature as if it were a verdict written in stone. Their faces drained of pride, replaced by the pallor of realization. The blueprint they had buried, the skills they had mocked, the man they had cast aside, he had just saved them. Every career in that room, every reputation, every carefully polished image they had built would have collapsed with the system had those pages not been there. They exchanged glances heavy with guilt, their silence an admission they could not put into words. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet the truth staring up from the paper. Others clenched their fists as though gripping the weight of their own betrayal. They had labeled me outdated, a relic. And yet, in their darkest hour, it was not their models or their algorithms that had steadied the city. It was my work, my calculations, my lines drawn in ink when no one else was watching. It was the so-called outdated skills they had mocked that had spared them disgrace. The younger engineers leaned closer, reading the signature again and again, as if the letters themselves held some mystery they had missed. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that wisdom does not vanish with age, that experience is not weakness, but memory written into action. And they felt the sting of their own arrogance, knowing that had they honored that truth earlier, the night might not have been filled with terror. The folder remained open, my name glowing faintly in the early sun. To them, it was no longer just a document. It was a mirror reflecting their failure, and a monument to a man they had tried to erase. And though I was not there to see it, I knew what their eyes carried in that moment, the dawning acceptance that their survival, their careers, their reputations had been built not on their brilliance, but on the shoulders of the very man they had dismissed. And in the silence of that room, the truth settled like a weight none of them could shake. Respect delayed is still respect owed, and legacy cannot be buried by pride. The shame did not arrive with noise. It settled slowly, like dust after an explosion, coating every face, every gesture, every thought. Those who only yesterday had laughed at me in hallways, who had rolled their eyes when I spoke, who had called me too old to keep up, now found it impossible to look in my direction. They turned their heads when I passed, busied themselves with papers that did not need reading, adjusted ties and watches with hands that trembled, anything to avoid meeting the eyes of the man they had buried in silence. Shame has no voice, yet it speaks louder than any reprimand. It bent their shoulders lower than exhaustion ever could. It tightened their throats until words felt dangerous. It weighed on their hearts until even a simple glance toward me carried the sting of confession. They had mocked me, excluded me, erased me from the table, and then, when the world began to fall apart, they clung to the very lines I had left behind. Every step they took to restore the system was a step on the foundation of the work they had once scorned. And now, in the fragile calm after the storm, their guilt stood naked before them. The younger engineers, who had whispered about the new era and celebrated my departure, now walked past me with downcast eyes. They no longer carried the arrogance of invincibility. They carried the knowledge that their pride had nearly drowned the city. For them, my presence was unbearable, not because I accused them, but because I did not. Silence was the cruelest judgment. In my calmness, they saw a mirror, and in that mirror, their own arrogance reflected back at them. The leaders. Those who had stripped me of voice while calling it honor. Sat in meetings with lips pressed tight, nodding too quickly, agreeing too often, their confidence shattered. They had built their reputations on dismissing me, parading innovation while burying experience. Now, though they would not say it aloud, they knew. Had it not been for the man they had discarded, they would be finished. Their names would have been remembered only for the collapse. Instead, my name, scrawled in the margin of a blueprint, had carried them. My daughter saw it too. She noticed the way people avoided me, the way their words faltered when I entered the room. She felt the weight of her own silence in years past, when she had not defended me against her husband's smirk or her colleague's dismissal. She carried her shame differently, not with avoidance, but with tears that she tried to hide. For her, the realization was heavier than for the others, because it was not only colleagues who had doubted me, it was family. And yet, I did not gloat. I did not speak of the betrayal, did not remind them of their cruelty. I walked through their shame with the quiet dignity of a man who no longer needed vindication. The truth had spoken for me. It pressed on their shoulders, heavier than any words I could utter, heavier than any anger I could express. They thought silence meant weakness. Now they learned it meant strength. Shame does not need an accuser. It lingers. It gnaws. It writes itself in the space between glances. And in those days after the crisis, the shame in their eyes was louder than the sirens had ever been. I returned to the plant, not with banners behind me, not with the strut of a man demanding recognition, but with the same quiet steps I had always carried. The air was heavy with unease. Eyes followed me, then quickly looked away. They expected anger, perhaps a lecture, perhaps the bitter satisfaction of a man wronged finally seizing his chance to scold. But I offered none of that. Fury is for those who still need to prove themselves. I had nothing to prove. The city itself was already my witness. When they approached me, their voices were hesitant, low, touched with guilt. They asked technical questions, not meeting my gaze, as though even to look into my eyes would expose their shame. I answered each question simply, directly, without malice. My hands moved over the machinery as they once had years ago, steady and certain, adjusting two small points where stress still lingered. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just the careful touch of someone who knew these systems as if they were living things. The silence around me deepened as they watched, because in every precise motion was a reminder. This was not outdated knowledge. This was mastery. I did not remind them of their insults, did not speak of the laughter that had greeted me when I warned them. I did not tell them of the long nights alone, writing notes no one would read. I simply worked, and when the last adjustment was complete, I stepped back. The machines exhaled in rhythm, steady now, almost as though they, too, recognized the difference between arrogance and care. They waited for me to say something, anything, to claim victory, to throw their humiliation back in their faces, but I remained silent. Dignity has no need for sharp words. It does not shout, it stands. It does not gloat, it endures. I gathered my tools, closed the panel, and nodded once to the room before walking away. The sound of my footsteps was the only speech I offered, and it echoed louder in their hearts than any triumphal declaration could have. For them, that silence was unbearable. It was heavier than anger, sharper than reproach. My calmness forced them to confront themselves, to see the truth of their pride and the hollowness of their judgment. They wanted me to be angry so they could defend themselves, to be bitter so they could excuse their guilt. But I denied them that. I left them only with the image of a man they had tried to erase, standing taller through stillness than they had ever stood through words. And in that quiet exit, something unshakable was born. They would forget many speeches in their lives, many reports, many presentations. but they would never forget the silence of that moment, the dignity of the man who had every right to rage, but chose instead to walk away with grace. That silence would haunt them longer than fury, and honor me longer than applause. The crisis passed, but its echo remained. In the weeks that followed, when the lights of the city glowed steadily once more, and the sirens faded into memory, the question lingered in every meeting, in every report, in every hushed conversation. What had truly saved them? Not the glossy presentations, not the digital models, not the leaders who had boasted of progress. It had been the folder no one wanted to open, the blueprint covered in dust, the lines drawn by a hand they had pushed aside. That truth could not be buried again. Slowly, reluctantly at first, the company acknowledged it. The blueprint was no longer a forgotten relic on a shelf. It became the foundation of their recovery plan. Engineers studied it page by page, tracing every margin note, every sequence of valves, every calculation written years before. What they had once called outdated now became their standard, the very language of survival. Manuals were rewritten with my diagrams at their core. Training sessions began with my notes as the first lesson. The arrogance of innovation bowed to the humility of experience. One day I walked the halls quietly, carrying no expectation, only the habit of a man who had spent his life in these walls. And there I saw it, a new course announced for young engineers, titled with my name. My chest tightened, not with pride, but with something heavier, almost sorrowful, for recognition always comes too late to erase the pain of having been dismissed. Yet even in its lateness, it mattered. They were teaching not just my methods, but my story, the story of how silence endured when laughter cut deep, how patience outlasted arrogance, how truth, though ignored, waited until the world could no longer deny it. In the main hall, they mounted a plaque. I stood before it, reading the words engraved into the steel. We begin with conscience and proven lines. The phrase was simple, stripped of ornament, but it carried the weight of everything I had lived. It was not merely about engineering. It was about responsibility, about remembering that systems are not built to impress investors, but to protect lives, that progress is worthless if it forgets the shoulders it stands on. People passed by the plaque each day, pausing in silence, and though many of them had never known me, they spoke my name as if it were already part of the foundation. I did not ask for monuments. I did not seek applause. But I saw now that legacy does not need noise. It lives in the steady rhythm of machines that no longer fail, in the lessons carried into classrooms, in the quiet awe of those who finally understood. My blueprint had become more than paper. It had become law, and in its lines, my voice lived on. For my colleagues, it was a reminder that arrogance can blind even the brightest eyes. For the leaders, it was a scar. They owed their survival to the man they had betrayed. For the younger engineers, it was a map to walk by, a warning that the future must never cut itself from the past. And for me, it was the quiet vindication I had never spoken for, the proof that dignity endures long after laughter dies. The city moved on, life resumed, new projects rose, but in every design, in every class, in every whispered story, my blueprint remained, not as a relic, not as nostalgia, but as a standard etched into steel, unerasable, like the lines that had once been drawn in ink, but now lived in memory. They had tried to bury me in silence. Instead, they had built my legacy into the very walls around them. And though my footsteps faded, my name endured, unsilenced, undeniable, unforgotten.